My house is smelling good with all different types of food.
Audio settings button. Mute button.
I don't know what that was, but it sounds like Drake the Rapper. Father Yahweh, give us understanding tonight as we search out your word. Help us to expand our minds to understand that there was never a time when you didn't speak. There was never a time when you weren't recorded. There was never a time when you weren't intimately involved in our affairs. And today, as we are once again attempting to get back to the basics, we bless you for allowing us to have the Dead Sea Scrolls and so many other texts come out of the ground these days. We pray that would be influential and that we would always be true to your word as you help us daily to expand your ministry, your ancient ministry of Yahshua HaMashiach and his dynasty. We pray in his name, amen. Okay, I'll just check one more time, see who's on. These guys that are late, they're just going to have to, they just don't know what they're missing. There's the conference center. All right, we got someone there. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found popping up out of the ground in 1947 to 1956. Now, previous to that, yes, various texts that belong to the same collection were found going back to probably the 5th century. And again, in the 9th century, a text that came out of the Cairo Geniza was discovered called the Zadokite Fragment, and that's how we've got Karaism right now, Karaite Jews from that fragment. People that realized that through that Zadokite fragment, what happened to the Zadokite priesthood, and that the scriptures had been changed, and that an oral Torah had been added with no quotes from Yahweh at all, but rather quotes from sages, confusing quotes, lots of commentaries that were diametrically opposed to one another. And we could very well be following today a Jesus that was a Pharisee rather than a Jesus that was an Essene. Understand, when I use the name Jesus, I'm using a technical term here. I know full well that his name is Yahshua. I know how to pronounce his name because Paul knew how to pronounce his name, and Paul recorded his name in Greek in the earliest New Testament text, which is 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1. You'll find it right in there, and there'll be no more question, if you know how to pronounce those letters, how his name is pronounced. After all, didn't Paul know Yeshua? Didn't he know Yaakov and Yehuda and Kipha and Yochanan and all these other ones that were part of the First Apostolic Assembly? Of course he did. He would then, obviously, speaking with these relatives of Yeshua, know how to pronounce his name and know how to write it down in his own language, because Paul wrote in Greek, no doubt about that. Take any challenger on that says that Paul wrote in Aramaic or Hebrew or something like that, or that he was Rabbi Shaul. I would like to challenge anybody that thinks that Paul was a rabbi to a little talk and debate. We're going to talk about Paul today and try to find out exactly who he was, because we've got lots of information about him that's not in his own letters, and his relationship with Yaakov, or James the Just, the brother and successor to Yahshua HaMashiach. Now, I spoke about the scrolls being found over the course of about 10 years, and that some had been found in earlier centuries. One had been found in the 19th century called the Shapira Strip, the earliest Torah that we don't have anymore, saying we don't have it because at the time the Shapira Strip with the Torah on it in Paleo-Hebrew was found. The scholars had never seen anything like it before and called it a forgery and sold it off in an auction. Fortunately, we still have the text that was transcribed from the Shapira manuscript, written on very thick old leather. Got information on my website about Shapira, and I've done a couple programs on it. The Shapira doesn't have 10 commandments. It's got 7 commandments spoken from the mouth of Yahweh, quite different than and it's a very short Torah rather than the long thing we have now with 5 books. I mention that because as part of what was probably the rest of the library, the scrolls, it wasn't found at that time. We've got to understand that our texts go back a lot earlier than what we have in our Bibles today, which is dated somewhere around 400 BC or between 500 and 300 BC. During the course of the discovery of the scrolls, as you know, some were published immediately. Some of the scholars that had the scrolls some of these scrolls were very quick to translate them and publish them. As I mentioned last night, in 1983 is when I first studied the scrolls, and I didn't find anything much interesting in them because the ones that are interesting, the ones that are controversial, the ones that come from the first century were primarily not translated by that time. We just had a big thick book full of texts that were very much like the biblical texts we have now and translated in dubious ways, to say the least. When more scrolls came out by 56, the consensus, of course, was that these Essenes were proto-Catholics. Proto-Catholics. They were monastics. They lived in monasteries. They were celibate. They were writing up scrolls and scriptures and codices, and that they were completely isolated from the world, just like the monastics that were given charge of these scrolls. In fact, the head of the scroll team at that time, Father Roland DeVoe, he was, as I used the title father, he was a Catholic priest and a monk. He was a monastic. No wonder the Qumran and the building there and the caves were considered part of a big monastery of study, and that the monks in the Qumran settlement there would go up to study into the caves, and those are their libraries. They made the Essenes in their own image. And they were also privy, speaking of this first scrolls team made up of Catholics, they're also privy to what was in all the scrolls that were found during that time. They were very selective in what they put out for publishing. They were selective for that very reason, that they saw what was in some of them, and they considered the impact of what those texts would the impact of those texts might be upon the church, primarily the Catholic Church. But there were some lay people at that time, like, for instance, there was a journalist, Miller Burroughs, that wrote a very influential article in one of the major publications, I think it was the New York Times, comparing what was in the scrolls that had been published and what had been written by Josephus and Philo as the very first Messianic believers of the Yahshua community. I'm loath to call them Christians, though scholars today call them Jewish Christians. I hear some people in the group coming along here. Miller Burroughs, there was, even as far back as 1790, Karl Barth, assuming the reading of Josephus concerning the Essenes. What he was really talking about there was the Yahshua movement and dynasty, and could the teacher of righteousness be Yahshua? Few more. Let me see. Charles Potter. Charles Potter was a Unitarian minister, lived in end of the 19th century through half the 20th century. Unitarian minister, started as a Baptist, lost his faith, and became the founder of the Humanist Society, first humanist society, which he considered to be a quasi-religion, and he based his religion of humanism on the Essene faith and the scrolls that he knew of and the writings of Josephus and Philo. Charles Potter wrote a couple very influential little books, which I have. One of them I've got right here someplace. One of the books is called, Did Jesus Write This Book? He's speaking of Second Enoch, a book that is very, very much like the writings of Yahshua that we have in the New Testament, especially the Beatitudes. In this book, Second Enoch's full of Beatitudes, also full of heavenly journeys. It defines 7 or 10 heavens and what are there. And it also talks about the birth of Melchizedek. So Potter thought maybe Yahshua wrote this book because it was so similar to what he talked about. And maybe he did. The other little book that I have here, that you can get these for nothing nowadays, is The Lost Years of Jesus. It seems to me like these books that were written before this standard model became the model of the Essenes that we have heard about from scholars. They all connected with the movement of Yahshua, but the Catholics resisted in this. Charles Potter, did Yahshua write this book? Right? Maybe he did. Finally, there was a great scholar at that time that did the same thing, was very influential. André Dupont Sommer, clear back in 1950. When only a few scrolls were available, he wrote, The Galilean Master Appears. As an astonishing reincarnation of the teacher of righteousness. He preached penitence, poverty, humility, love of neighbor, and chastity. The law of Moses, like him, he was the elect and Messiah of Elohim and Redeemer of the world. Both were the objects of priestly hostility. Both condemned to death. Both pronounced judgment on Jerusalem. Both prophesied 40 years. And at the end, both judge. The people that believed that the scrolls and the Essenes were anything like the first Jewish Christian movement, they were ostracized to the point of even friendly fellowship with other scholars and colleagues because of their view that went so against this original standard model by the priestly bunch of people that had the scrolls and were trying to translate the scrolls, that They were completely ostracized, and the whole idea of Yeshua being involved in the scrolls died out.
Hey, you guys, I'm broadcasting down here.
Okay. Okay, come down anytime. Already started. So we got in our New Testament, of course, we know that these texts have been highly redacted. Some are quite late. Of course, they emphasize the teachings of Paul. Hello. I already started this.
No, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Just, tonight, because you're late, we're going to have to pass a plate. That's all. That's all there is to it. And Paul has purportedly 13 letters in the New Testament. Of those, we're pretty certain that 7 of them are genuine, 6 are not. So we've got an original Paul, and we got maybe 4 other second Pauls or pseudo-Pauls. But even though these writings are very contradictory, if you take a look at, say, Romans versus Colossians, or Corinthians versus Ephesians, you're going to see a huge difference in the theology of the two. The later the Paul, the more Gnostic it gets. There's one particular passage that I want to point out, and that's in Galatians 2:20. There's auxiliary passage to that in James 2:20. This is easy to remember, 2:20. We see in Galatians an ongoing dialogue with James in his epistle. If we take the second chapter of both and we line them up, we find that the topics are right in line. It's like one is answering the other. And in fact, that's got to be the case. There's no other explanation for it. This particular place, the 2:20, hello. Paul says, very familiar passage, you probably know it by heart, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Not just I, but Christ, Christos, lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of Elohim who loved me and gave his life for me. What does James say to that? Go to 2:20 in this dialectic, and James has just a short word for Paul regarding his claim. He says, you empty man. Why does James say that? Paul says, your brother is dead, but his spirit has come into me when I died with him. I was crucified, he was crucified, but his spirit has come out of him into me and has, in a very real way, resurrected my dead bones and body. And now this spirit of Christos fuels me, walks in my shoes, inhabits my body. Paul goes on to say that to the Galatians, you need to follow me because Christ is in me, and I can make it so Christ can be in you too. Now, think about it. I don't know if you have a brother or not. If you had a brother, your brother died, and somebody claimed that he had died too, and that the spirit of your brother had inhabited him, and though his body was dead, he's made alive because the spirit of your brother was moving his legs and moving his mouth and getting his heart beating. I would have a very hard time with that. Your brother Pete, Pete's passed away, but his spirit has come into me, and now everything that he was, I am. That is hard to take for a brother. And this is why James calls him an empty man, because he's empty. So whether what Paul's saying is true or not, I don't know. What James is saying certainly matches up with the rest of the dialectic between him and Paul. They are not friends. They are enemies from the first. And as we'll get into it here in a minute, we know that Paul attempted to kill James and left him for dead on the temple steps in accordance with Clementine Recognitions, Book 1, Chapter 70. Then we read in the Acts, Chapter 21, there's reciprocity here because the elders of the assembly tried to kill Paul. They set him up to go into the temple with a couple of Greeks, and he was recognized immediately because it was a plot, I am sure, against him. Paul comes out, his life in jeopardy. He goes to the Romans, and all of a sudden he is assigned a cohort of 470 Roman soldiers that, if we look at the Apocrypha, we find these same soldiers escorted him not only to Rome, but to Spain, Britain, Gaul, Helvetia, and then back to Rome again, where he preached through the military outposts in Europe with a military escort. That's a very, very interesting. That comes from Acts 29. Well, Acts only goes up to 28, but there is another chapter that has been found that talks about Paul's journey to Britain with his cohort of soldiers and where he preached on the way back. Our canonical Gospels just don't tell us much. What they do tell is sometimes dubious because we've got brothers of Yeshua. We got a whole family there, cousins, a mother, perhaps even a father, who in the Gospels and Acts are put down completely, marginalized, minimalized. We know that though Yeshua's successor by the laying on of hands was his brother Yaakov, still, anything that those brothers do in the scripture is contradictory to the Messiah. And when we get to Acts, it's awfully strange that it takes us 15 chapters till we get to the Jerusalem assembly, where James turns up. And he doesn't only turn up there, he's the decision maker for the entire movement when he talks about how the Gentiles might be brought into the Messianic assembly. Remember, there were 4 or 5 different things there: no eating of blood, no fornication. And he says, and isn't the Torah of Moses taught every Sabbath in the synagogue? The assumption was that the Gentiles were, in some respects, going to become Jews to do that. So we are not informed by the canonical Acts about much of anything concerning James and his brothers. We got to go to other sources for that. Thank goodness there are a number of other sources that we are not really encouraged to read in church or religious communities. We are, in fact, where I go to church, I'm told every Sunday you should read nothing but the King James Bible. I imagine that's typical. No books, no novels, no commentaries, certainly no Apocrypha. You read the King James Bible, that's the only thing in the world worth reading. But there is a lot out there that believers don't know about that might change their mind about everything. One of those sources is Eusebius of Caesarea or Caesarea. Eusebius was bishop of Caesarea in Palestine during the reign of Constantine, the emperor. He was there 260 to 340. He tells us in his ecclesiastical church history that James was, and I quote, the master's brother, who had been elected by the apostles to the episcopal throne. That means the movakership, or the head of the movement in Jerusalem, coming from the church historian. And he's admitting that. Knowing Yeshua would soon depart, and his disciples, according to the non-canonical book, the Gospel of Thomas, which I call the fifth gospel, they asked Yeshua who would lead them. And here's the quote from there, the Gospel of Thomas. Yeshua said to them, in the place you're to go to Yaakov HaZadik, James the just, or the righteous one, for whose sake heaven and earth came into existence, because he's the successor to the Son of Man. And of course, that term, Zadik, James the just is Zadik, that is the same term used in the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Essenes, the priests of the Essenes, the Zadokite priesthood. The Palestinian Epiphanius, he was the bishop of Salamis. Salamis, Bologna, all right. 315 to 404. He had access to works that we don't have anymore. One was called the Anabathmoi Jacobi, the ascents of James, the ascents, the going up. These are still found now in the Clementine homilies, or what we know as the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles. In this work and in the Gospel of the Hebrews, another work that was destroyed by the church, by the state, that we only have a few quotes from. Sources here I'm talking about used by the Ebionites, the ancient Jewish Christians that followed James, also known as the poor, or the Ebionim, the poor. Now those works are both lost, though incorporated in quotes in other writings, in which, and I quote, once during a drought, Yaakov lifted his hands to the sky and prayed, and at once the sky sent rain. So Yaakov was known as a rainmaker, along with others of his family, like perhaps you've heard of Honi the circle drawer. But we know the brother Yeshua did just the opposite kind of miracle as he stopped the rain. Yaakov, James is called in the New Testament Alphaeus in one place. Hi. Alphaeus is not a person. James, the son of Alphaeus. The word son of is not in there. Alphaeus refers to a priesthood out of Egypt, the Alphi priesthood of rainmakers. So we've got a little bit of insight into right now into the power of Yaakov or James. But they no longer call him by his name, but his name was rather the righteous one, or Zadik. They called him Zadik, the righteous, or the just. Here's another quote. To Yaakov alone, it was allowed to enter once a year into the Kadosh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies. Think of what they're saying here. Once a year, James, the brother of Yeshua, enters the Holy of Holies. Who's allowed to go in there? Nobody. It says because he was a Nazarite and connected to the priesthood, the Zadokite priesthood, of course. Hence, Mary was related in two ways to Elizabeth, That's John the Baptist's mother. And James was a distinguished member of that Zadokite priesthood because the two tribes alone were linked to one another, the royal tribe and the priestly tribe. This is, again, according to Epiphanius in his Panarion, or his medicine chest of heresies. Two tribes connected. How do they get to connected? If you look at Yeshua's genealogy, there is a person of note in there that we never look at. His name is Jotham. Jotham. He was a king after the order of the kings of David. But there is a note in Chronicles where we get Jotham's genealogy, his Toledot. It says Jotham, whose mother was Yarusha. What does that sound like? Yarusha, Jerusalem. His mother was Yarusha, daughter of Zadok, the priest. So through Jotham, the family that comes through Mary had the bloodline of both David the king and the right priesthood, the Zadokite priesthood that was prophesied to be priests forever. That's why these guys were hunted down by emperors for another 200 years. And according to my reckoning, at least 4 of the brothers, Yeshua, Yaakov, Yehuda, and Shimon, were executed in a collusion between the usurping priesthood in Jerusalem and the Romans. 4 brothers dead through that because of their bloodline. So in the Ascents of James, there was a discussion on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem, we are told. We're told this by the Nazarene Acts. And it says that the temple masses of people proclaimed Yaakov to be the first to whom the master entrusted his throne upon earth, the successor. So we've got Yeshua, he's gone. Yaakov comes, not Peter, who got the keys to the kingdom. Peter had to go into exile, as you remember, it says in Acts. So James alone enjoyed the privilege of entering the Holy of Holies. Listen here, another quote from Josephus. Indeed, he didn't wear wool, but only linen clothes. They didn't wear wool in the temple because the temple was an extremely holy place, and wool would cause one to sweat. No air conditioning at that time. But only linen clothes. We know that the Essenes only wore linen. Linen was a fabric at that time that did not cause sweating. It did not absorb sweat either. And he went into the temple alone, into the Holy of Holies, to pray on behalf of the people, so that his knees were reputed to have acquired the calluses of a camel's knees. And then after Yeshua died, he was immediately appointed the bishop, or in Hebrew, the Mevaker, of Jerusalem by the apostles. There's another witness outside of the canon. There was a Jewish believer in the late 1st century that we get fragments of right now, whose name was Hegesippus. Of course, that comes from a Hebrew name, Ha-Gasip. Hegesippus lived somewhere around 90 AD, nearly 100 years. Portions of these 5 books of church history survive, but only in little passages, again, in the historian Eusebius, who tells us there were many Jameses. There were many Jacobs. But this one, the master's brother, was holy from his birth. Everyone from the master's time till our time has called him just, righteous, or Zadik in Hebrew. Zadik. A Zadik, Zedekah means righteousness. A Zadik is a title for a righteous person. And that, because of his unsurpassable righteousness, he was called the just, the Zadik, and oblius, which is a kind of a obscure term that Hegesippus tells us means, from Greek, the bulwark of the people and righteousness. For Epiphanius, one of the church heresiologists that I mentioned before, he says oblius means the wall or the buttress or the protector of the people. He was extremely popular in his day, and we find that in Acts 21, in that passage I mentioned before, where the elders are saying, really James is saying, look, Paul, at the thousands who are zealous for the Torah. He's the head of them. In fact, he becomes an opposition high priest, remembering that the priesthood that was in Jerusalem at this time were usurpers. They were not religious people. They were business people interested in making money, buying their priesthood from the Herods, paying off the Romans so they could make money. And that's what they did with their hot dog stands and beer concessions and pennants and flags and little olive wood characters of Jesus in the manger inside the temple. There's another very early text called the Apostolic Constitutions, not to the Dead Sea Scrolls yet, but we'll get there. The Apostolic Constitutions tell us that Yaakov was the brother of Messiah according to the flesh and the one appointed as the Mavaker or overseer or bishop of Jerusalem by the master himself. Here's another witness. In a passage that is only surviving in the historian Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria, who lived about 150 AD, tells us that the gift of knowledge was imparted by Yahshua into Yaakov the righteous, James the just, to Yochanan, John, and to Kepha, Peter. And that these in turn delivered it to the rest of the apostles and to the 70, of whom Barnabas was one. We have an epistle of Barnabas that was in the canon and was taken out by the Catholic Church, purportedly because it was too Jewish. The epistle of Barnabas is one of the ones I translated to put it back into circulation because it is of great importance. It has Barnabas calling together the believers after the destruction of Jerusalem when, as you know, millions of Jews were massacred or sent off to slavery. The movement had to start all over again, so to speak. The Catholics call Clement, the writer of the Clementine journals, epitomes, which again we call Nazarene Acts of the Apostles. They claim Clement as one of their popes. He lived from 30 AD, about to 97. Addresses his letter in the Nazarene Acts to James. Clement is assigned by James to follow Peter wherever he goes, write down what Peter says and what Peter does, the Acts of Peter, and to report in a book to James in a periodic fashion. This book, the Nazarene Acts or the Clementine recognitions, is extremely important. Extremely. Like following Paul around in the Acts of the Apostles, just follows Peter, and contains some of the very, very earliest of the doctrines and practices of the people of our faith. he addresses a letter back to James, calls him the bishop of bishops, or the Mavakar Mavakarim, the one who rules the assembly in Jerusalem, rules the Hebrews and the assemblies everywhere. And so Clement, who is claimed by the Roman Catholics to be their second or fourth pope, we have an extant in the Nazarene Acts, a letter about Kippah to the head of the movement, James, concerning Peter and his welfare. Even we have Peter's last confessions at his death that is also conveyed from Clement to James. Even Josephus, who, as you remember, was a historian, was a priest of the temple. He was a turncoat. He was a general for Israel, and he went to save his own life. He went with the Romans and became a translator for General Titus, who eventually destroyed Jerusalem. Josephus was there during this time. He was a contemporaneous almost with Yeshua, but certainly with James, and he knew James. So Josephus, who may or may not have been a believer, there have been parts of Josephus that have been taken out of what we have in our Josephus that has surfaced somewhere else, that makes it clear to us that if he wasn't a believer, he was very, very curious about the movement, and he had his own theories about it. That's called the Slavonic Josephus, if you ever want to know about that and read about what he has to say about John the Baptist and Yeshua and James. We can get that in the Slavonic version. He insists in several places that it was James' death in 62 AD that was the reason for the fall of all Israel, because when James was executed, all of Israel rose up. He was the obelisk, the pillar, the last standing pillar of all Israel. The other ones being John the Baptist, his brother Yeshua. The only pillar left was he, and when he fell, the Israelites revolted against Rome. Because again, we have the priests and Rome in cahoots to kill James, just like they did Yeshua. These things, says Josephus, that is the uprising and consequent destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, happened to the Jews in requital for James the Righteous, Yaakov HaZadik, who was a brother of Yeshua known as Christos, or Messiah. For though he was the most righteous of men, the Jews put him to death. I'm going to learn about that death in just a minute. This same passage is also remarked by Origen, who was an early, what we call a church father, but more of a Nazarene style from France. Origen, some people pronounce it Origen, but it's Origen. And Jerome, the translator of the Greek text of the Bible into Latin, that translation called the Vulgate or the Vulgate, only exists in Eusebius's commentary on the Galatians. And it's interestingly enough, this remark is no longer extant in any manuscript that we have of Josephus. It's been cut out, but it's been discovered again in the writings of the church historian who quotes him. Now, Eusebius, the historian, quotes Josephus extensively many times. Why is that not in our copies of Josephus anymore? Curious, very curious. What he purports that Josephus said was, so remarkable a person must Yaakov have been, so universally esteemed for righteousness, that even the most intelligent of the Jews felt this was why his martyrdom was immediately followed by the siege of Jerusalem, which contradicts the Christian belief that the temple fell because of the death of Jesus. And Origen is well aware of it in his writing called Contra Celsus, that is, against Celsus, who also says that, and I quote, "The wonderful thing is that though he," that is Josephus, "didn't accept Yeshua as Messiah, he yet gave testimony that the righteousness of Yaakov," James, "was so great that the people thought they had suffered these things on account of him." For his part, Jerome, the translator, who lived with the Nazarenes in Israel, in his publication Vita, or Vita, V-I-T-A, just means his biography, his life, this same Josephus records the tradition that this James was of so great holiness and reputation among the people that the destruction of Jerusalem was believed to have occurred on account of his death. Likewise, in his commentary, he says, "So holy was James that the people zealously tried to touch the fringes of his garment. These are the fringes commanded to be worn by observant Jews in Numbers 15:38, which I'm not wearing today for some reason, so that when you see them, you'll remember all the commandments of Yahweh and do them." These, again, are the words of Jerome, the Roman Catholic translator, who in many ways calls the Nazarenes and Ebionites heretics, but he tells us the truth about his own observations being with the Nazarenes and learning the Hebrew from the Nazarenes. "For whose sake heaven and earth came into existence, holy from his birth, the righteous one, bulwark of the people, Jerusalem falling on account of his death." Really strong words. We can't lightly dismiss them. I've had people dismiss such words because where are they in the Bible? Is that in Torah? If it's not in Torah, I don't believe it. You wouldn't believe how many times I've heard this. Where do you find that in Bible? Not just any Bible. It's got to be in the King James Bible, or as some of my friends call it, the St. James Bible. Yet these comments about James are consistent with all the sources that we have that talk about him. Obviously, much more than we have about the Messiah. It's important to point out that our sources aren't presenting Jacob as just the head of Christianity, but the most popular Jewish leader of his day. The Zaddik, the famous one, righteous par excellence, whose death brought the downfall of Jerusalem and is in keeping with the notion of Proverbs 10:25 and the Kabbalah, Zohar 159, that the Zaddik is the foundation. Remember, we talked about the obelisk, the pillar. When he became the last pillar, they called him Hayasod. Hayasod, the foundation of the very nation of Israel. Paul understands it when he speaks in Galatians of going up to Jerusalem and meeting Yaakov, Kepha, and Yochanan, James, Cephas, and John, those reputed to be pillars, oblioi, reputed to be pillars, Galatians 2:9. Paul has a bad attitude toward these guys. And his attitude toward them is very, very helpful in determining who is the parallel character to Paul in the Dead Sea Scrolls, known as the windbag, the comedian, the lying spouter, the man of scoffing. You notice when you read Paul, I got nothing against Paul. I'm not anti-Paul. I'm for Paul. I just don't understand. If you read Paul in the Greek, you would think that he was probably the greatest genius that ever lived. His writings are scientific. They're scientific. They're up to date. They are, what would we say today? They are quantum. They are quantum when he talks about the height and depth and breadth and the other thing, 4 dimensions here. In Greek, it's very scientific. He's talking science here. He's talking about something that he's gotten from somewhere else other than Galen or some of the other doctors of faith and medicine of that time. But he reputes that these guys are pillars. A spotter of lies. Oh, what was I saying? That you read through Paul, and he says time after time, I'm not lying. I don't lie. No, I don't lie. I'm not a liar. Who's accusing him of being a liar? We don't know. But it's funny how that is one characteristic of one character in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a scroll that certainly is dated to 60 to 70 AD, talks about a particular one named the lying spouter. Spouter is the same word as boasting. Look at 2 Corinthians sometime, even Galatians. Count how many times Paul boasts. How many times Paul says, I don't want to boast. He says, I'll boast in myself. I'll boast in my sufferings. I'll boast in you. The lying boaster. I don't lie. I will boast. I won't boast. Josephus and Hegesippus, both of them very early. Josephus, 1st century, Hegesippus, the end of the 1st century. And because of them, later ones like Clement of Alexandria and Hippolytus, Origen, Eusebius, Epiphanius, Jerome, I mentioned them all. Even ancient Christian literature, recently found in Egypt at Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels, know of James' death. Why doesn't Acts tell us about it? James just disappears. He shows up to make a decision about Gentiles and he disappears. He's the head of the community in the whole world. Why is he not in Acts? Well, because Josephus knew of it firsthand. It would seem best to use his account. Him, a man who knew James, obviously, especially from his Slavonic version. According to him, the Roman governor died in 62 CE. Who was that Roman governor? Fatus, one of those guys. Funny, those Roman governors of Syria. Festus, Felix, Fatus. Felix, these guys were despots, murderers, money grubbers, niece marriers. You call that when you have relations with your sister, you call that incestuous. Felix means happy. Festus means festive. And Fatus, I'll let you look that one up. That's good. These guys with these names, so funny. You probably got those from Latin study. They got Latin names. Now, the new governor was on his way. The new governor, I do remember his name, Albinus. The establishment high priest, Ananus ben Ananus. Now, remember, we have at the beginning of Luke a high priest named Annas, Annas. Annas was the past high priest when Yeshua was born. Remember, it says that Annas, let me put it this way. Annas was a usurper. He paid for his high priesthood to the Herods, of course. But Annas and 5 of his sons and 1 of his son-in-laws all were high priests in the first century. So this high priesthood was sewed up. There was just one time Herod put somebody else in just so they pay more. So they've got Annas, his son-in-law Caiaphas, his son Theophilus, his son Matthias, and finally his son Ananus. All of these, Ananus being the last one. So here comes Ananus being now the high priest, being appointed by the governor who hasn't got there yet. So, I want to make sure I get this right. Ananus used the occasion of his high priesthood to try and execute the brother of Joshua, James. Again, this is in 62. Because of his life as the leader of the Yeshua movement. And here I'll quote the Antiquities of the Jews from Josephus. Ananus, or as they, Annas, sometimes they call him, or in the Baptist church they call him Anus. He assembled, honestly, I heard a preacher reading Luke chapter 2, I think it is. And he said, the high priest Annas and Caiaphas. All right. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Yeshua, who was called Christos, Messiah, whose name was Yaakov, and some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the Torah, he delivered them to be stoned. But those citizens who seemed to be most equitable and the most careful in the observation of the Torah were offended by this. Reported by, again, Josephus. 2 generations later, a more legendary account is recorded again by Hegesippus, who was a Nazarene believer, converted over to Roman Catholicism somehow, with a note that Yaakov James proved a true witness to Jews and Gentiles alike that Yeshua is the Messiah. In the Nazarene Acts, the assembly of the master, which was constituted in Jerusalem, was most plentifully multiplied and grew, being governed with the most righteous ordinances by Yaakov. Our master and true prophet, who has sent us, declared to us that the evil one, having disputed with him for 40 days, but failing to prevail against him, promised that he would send apostles from among his subjects to deceive them. Therefore, above all, remember to shun any apostle. This is Peter talking, Kipha. Shun any apostle, teacher, or prophet who does not accurately compare his teaching with Yaakov. And this, even if he comes to you with recommendations. See, James had a vault, and he kept the preachings of Peter in that vault. So, because Peter had asked him, don't let anybody read my teachings unless they're approved, because already people are going out there and writing stuff in my name that I never conceived of, and I'm not even dead yet. That's why we have 1 Peter in the Bible. I call it Peter Paul. It's simply not Petrine, it's Pauline. In the recognitions, we learn about another person named Saul or Shaul, whom Peter says, one of our enemies. Well, upon entering the temple with a few others while James was reading and interpreting prophecy concerning Yeshua, this Saul began to cry out, and while Yaakov the bishop was refuting him, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting and undo what was arranged with much labor. a riot ensues, in the midst of which this enemy attacked James and threw him headlong down from the top of the temple steps, and supposing him dead, cared not to inflict further violence upon him. One thing this quote doesn't tell us is that first this Saulus beat James with, got a little fireplace here. What do you call a poker? Beat him with a brand from the altar first, knocking him down the steps. Though James doesn't die at that time, both his legs are broken. That might account for the earlier attestation that he had knees like camels from praying on them. Maybe he broke his legs in those places. So our friends lifted him up, and we returned to the house of Yaakov and spent the night there in prayer. Then before daylight, we went down to Jericho to the number of 5,000 men. So what's happened here is James is attacked, left for dead. They go to the house, get him ready, and everybody en masse leaves out of Jerusalem to the redoubt. I think that's an army term or a military term, a redoubt. You ever heard of that? That's some place where you're up here on the line fighting, but back here someplace, you've got a hideout or a big ditch dug that's fortifications that you could drop back to if you have to. That's what they had in Jericho. Something very interesting here that I don't have in this essay, but on the way to Jericho, they stopped by a cemetery that was well known because there were two sepulchers or stela, what we call them here, gravestones, big gravestones, that every year whitened of themselves. They had been two brothers that had been martyred earlier for the faith. And the explanation is that these two whitened of themselves every year as a sign to unbelievers, that these fellows that had been martyred weren't dead, but were alive in one form or the other. So the miracle was that every year when those things would gray during the winter, back in the summertime, they would get white again. Now, some have argued that the Nazarene Acts is nothing but a novel because there's nothing in it that we could find archaeologically. So 10 years ago, Robert Eisenman and his class from South California University, or wherever it is, were over in Israel. They were taking the same route from Jerusalem to Jericho that they assumed that the Nazarenes were taking as they fled. And they thought, is it possible we might find these stones that whiten of themselves? And they were walking along, and one of the students said, look at that. There they were. There they were, a big destroyed cemetery with two mounds and broken stones there after all this time. So what they found was a confirmation of an archaeological site written up in the Clementines, the Nazarene Acts, that no one had ever found before. And do you think that anybody will confirm that? Not a soul. Not a soul, except YouTube. You can go out to YouTube and see it. See it there. So we've got an actual historical confirmation of that particular book. As for Shaul, it tells us in the Acts of the Apostles, he made havoc for the ecclesia, and breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Master, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this W-A-Y, the way. That's what they called themselves. The people in this book, the Dead Sea Scrolls, throughout, call themselves the way, exactly the same. Those of the way, whether they be men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And on this trip, now according to the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible, Paul first sees Yeshua. But the manner in which he proved that this was the Christos, the Christ, and I quote, confounded the Jews who dwelled in Damascus. And that after this, the Jews took counsel to kill him, watching the gates night and day to kill him. There's so much side stuff going on. Here's Paul in Damascus. He writes that I had to let me down over the wall in a basket in Damascus. Well, you got to know that, first of all, that Paul is the grandson of Salome Herod. That's Herod the Great's sister, Salome. Paul had brother, Costobarus. Paul had a sister. We read that in Acts. Her name was Cypros. He had a nephew we read about in Acts. His name was Julius Archelaus. What this means, we talked about last night, Paul greeting his kinsman, Herodian, the littlest Herod, and missing the littlest Herod's mother, Salome, who had John's head on a platter. Josephus talks about this same Saulus, about his being a riotous bandit in Jerusalem and causing all kinds of problems. And he says that Saulus and his brother Costobarus got away with this all the time because they were kinsmen of the king. Funny that this account of Saulus in Josephus, book 20 of the Antiquities, is right after the death of James. There's the death of James there, him being stoned after he's thrown off the parapet of the temple. And then right after that, and a riot ensued, Saulus and Costobarus approaching people, beating, and just like in this temple steps thing. And they get away with this every time because they're cousins to King Herod Agrippa. They're cousins to all the Herodians. He comes from Herod's sister, the notorious Salome, through Aristobulus III was his father. His mother's name was Cypros. You can look right on the Herodian genealogy, and there he is, Saulus, Costobarus, Cypros, his sister, and then Julius Archelaus. Paul was a Herodian. No wonder they were scared of him. No wonder, we'll go on with this. I think we'll get to that. No wonder he would make havoc for the assembly. The side story again, another side story here is the reason that he made havoc for the assembly is because as a Herodian, it was his ambition to marry the daughter of the high priest. High priest at that time was Theophilus, the high priest. Funny that Luke writes to a Theophilus. We don't know who he is, but there's a high priest at the same time he's writing named Theophilus, the very same one that Paul wanted to marry his daughter, and Paul took this on to prove himself as the type of person they would want in the family to marry their daughter. Paul, you notice Paul eschews marriage in all his writings. Maybe the one that he wanted, he just couldn't get because of his conversion. And, all right. I'm getting off the subject like crazy. Oh, but the letting down in the basket, Paul preaching. Paul preaching a peaceful message of love your neighbor, etc. And he gets in trouble. They want to kill him and put him down. You have to put him down in a basket. What it doesn't mention there is he is a Herodian at that time. The king of Damascus, Aretas, was at war with Paul's cousin, Herod Antipas. Why? Because Herod Antipas dumped Aretas' daughter, whose name was it'll come to me. I know you don't care anyway. Dumped his daughter to marry Herodias, his brother's daughter, who was also his niece. And this is where the Salome thing comes. Remember, we've got Herod Antipas and Herodias, his brother's daughter, and she brings her daughter along, Salome. There was a war going on there between the two. And Paul, the cousin of these people, is in Damascus. Is he preaching a gospel of peace and love? Or is he recognized? He would have been famous at that time, well known, because every kingship in the entire Middle East was a Herod was on the throne. Not just in Jerusalem or Israel. Everywhere out there in all these little provinces, all these little places, a Herodian, including in Parthia. There was a Herodian on there too. That was a big empire to the east. So he's let down in the basket because he's preaching love. I don't think he's, we wouldn't want to call the founder of Christianity a liar, though, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls does. This is how Paul comes to know the movement. He says, I certify to you, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I didn't receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but it came from a revelation of Jesus Christos. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the assembly of Yahweh violently and tried to destroy it. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me, that is Jesus Christos, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh or blood, nor did I go up to those who were apostles before me, nor did I go up to those who were apostles before me. Remember, the purported pillars, he says in Galatians, but I went away into Arabia and again returned to Damascus. Why would he go to Arabia? That's a big mystery about Paul. It seems simple to me. Paul's a Herodian. That's where they were from. The Herods were Idumeans, all raised up in Rome. Paul's part of that. He goes home after this whole ordeal in Damascus. He goes back where it's safe, to Idumea. That's Arabia. Of course, this is all speculation based on accounts from ancient sources, contemporaneous sources, but they begin to add up after a while. Then he says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Kepha and stayed with him 15 days. Don't tell me that Paul didn't know how to say the name Yahshua. But I saw none of the other apostles except Yaakov, the master's brother. Now the things I'm writing to you before God, here we go. I do not lie. If you have bitter jealousy and contentious in your heart, do not boast and lie against the truth. This is what James says to Paul in the